Hello, my name is Dr. Joanna Kujava, and I'm the author of Alien Goddess, UFOs, AI, and the Goddesses of Ascension. In last video, we discussed the events of Fatima in 1916 and 1917, when a large crowd of people, over 70,000 people, experienced something very powerful. Some people believed that they experienced the apparition of a white lady, a feminine figure, which was there to give a warning to humanity in difficult times. It was the end of World War I, and she gave several warnings. Other people believe that it was a UFO event, even others that it was a strange weather event, and so on. Then we briefly discussed Chris Bledsoe's White Lady, another white lady that appeared to someone, which gave him some predictions about 2016 and also asked him to share it with the rest of us. So what I found interesting in this, that in both cases, there was a feminine figure, that she was benevolent, and that she had a message for humanity, and there was some good intention behind it. Her intention was to help us. However, what was really interesting for me also was that nobody really knew what form of event it was. It definitely something happened there, because even two men who wanted to debunk the event in Fatima, they experienced something really powerful. They just didn't interpret it in religious terms. So the questions to ask are the following. Is it a spiritual event? Is it a UFO? Is it something else? And I'm perhaps giving away my conclusion right now, but in my research, I reached a conclusion based on works of other people as well, that I mentioned in this video, that it was an interdimensional or multidimensional event. And then we actually quite commonly experience encounters with beings or entities from other dimensions when we are in so-called liminal spaces, which means in between, usually between waking and sleep. So I would like to dive a little bit more into this in this video. And if you're interested in this topic, please find the description of my book and a link to my book in the description box below. All right, so let's just start with that right now. So even in the UFO community, the name UFO changed its meaning. So it started as unidentified flying objects, then it moved to unidentified aerial phenomena, and now it moved to unidentified anomalous phenomena. And I like the last one most, simply because I think that we all experience strange events in our lives, which are actually exactly behind the threshold, so to speak, in the liminal spaces between dream and sleep. Very often they could be called lucid dreams, that we encounter other beings and entities, and they are very vivid for us, and they also try at least to pass some message to us, and whether we understand it or not is it's a different story, and perhaps I'll have a time to get into this. So what actually happens there? So perhaps let's go through the history of scholarship about it. So when I started to look into it, of course, I couldn't omit Jacques Vallée, who is a very legitimate researcher. He worked for NASA. He tried to map Mars, and he's also a very famous researcher of UFO events. And many years ago, he wrote a famous book, Passport to Magonia, in which he explores or catalogs, actually, as he calls it himself in his book, strange events throughout human history. So some of them were like flying hats, for example, like an event that occurred in 1577 in one town in Germany, when people saw what we would nowadays call spaceships. They call them flying hats. And there was an event in Japan when the whole army of noticed some unusual phenomena on the sky, and so on and so on. So these are famous examples that were explored in many other books and even in many documentaries about UFOs and this kind of phenomena. So what I liked about Jacques Vallée's work, it is that he brought my attention to the fact that UFOs may be not necessarily spaceship. They do not have to be technological in nature. I have no doubt that some of them are, but my interest lies in this other form of UFO or anomalous phenomena, because they kind of stand in the threshold between spiritual and or multidimensional events, and this is what I'm really interested in. And next researcher that I looked into this, and it's one of my favorite authors on UFOs, is Professor Diana Pasuka and her famous book American Cosmic. There she gives many, many examples of this kind of events, and she actually writes about UFOs as being possibly a new form of religion and so on. And it could be true, although I do not necessarily agree with this, but I loved her example. So for example, in one example, she talks about a white orb appearing in somebody's living room, and it happened after the woman who was a Catholic was praying, and she was praying for her dog, beloved dog, to be healed, and the orb healed the dog. However, what was really interesting that she interpreted this presence that she somehow managed to summon through her prayer, presumably as angels, when her husband thought it was a kind of metallic orb. So again, we're in this gray area. What was it really? Was it a religious experience of angels, or was it a luminous orb of some form, a UFO event, or perhaps what I would call interdimensional event? Another great example that everybody talks about Professor Pasuka's book is about Tyler Dees examples, who is a famous, he actually doesn't want to be named, so it's his pseudonym, but he's a well-known kind of scientist, so to speak, but at least he claims to get downloads from off-planet intelligences. This is how he calls it. What is interesting about his downloads, it is that they actually help scientists with degrees and so on to figure out problems that they couldn't figure out, when he has access to this, what he calls off-planet intelligences that actually pass this kind of mechanical engineering and very physical form of evidence that helps them to solve the problems. He's also famous for his protocols, what he calls protocols, which help him to get in contact with this off-planet intelligences. Now, he calls them downloads. What was interesting for me about it, that lots of artists and saints and ecstatics throughout the millennia had the similar experiences, but they were not of technological manner. They were more on nature, but they were more of artistic nature, or they were more of spiritual nature. So when I was reading testimonies of Taylor D in Professor Pasuka's book, I started to be slightly alarmed that very often this kind of downloads, which could be spiritual or in his case are technological, that they should not take us perhaps in the one direction, which is direction of technology. But I found it really interesting, the fact that his downloads were of technological nature. They were deemed much more reliable than, for example, a beautiful inspiration that came through to an artist, or perhaps ecstatic vision of a saint. And I think this probably is partially or completely responsible for the fact that we live in a very materialistic society, focused on science completely. And science at the moment is very much focused on the physical, material, and measurable, when many of these events are not measurable, and they are not even fully physical. And that led me to work of Rick Strassman, who is a medical doctor, and he wrote many famous books on hallucinogenic experiences with his patients. And for example, he was giving a very certain measures of hallucinogenic substances, DMT, to his volunteers, and many of them, not only that most of them had amazing experiences, but he started to notice that there was a similar narrative in those experiences, and that this narrative was not so different from certain experiences of abductions, or what people call UFO experiences. And he said that this kind of experiences are non-corporeal, and I really like this name because they are non-physical, and therefore they are not measurable, yet they are very real and they are very vivid, and sometimes they are life-changing for people who experience them. So what are some of the similarities? So for example, I'm just talking about those that are similar to UFOs, UFO sightings. So for example, some people experience being on a different planet. Sometimes the planet was very similar to our planet Earth. Sometimes it was a completely different planet. Some people experienced being on some kind of station in space station, and very often encountered beings. Some of the beings were what in UFO communities called small grays, some completely different beings. Most of them were humanoid. And on many occasions, these beings actually expected the person to arrive, or were surprised that he arrived or she arrived, or were sometimes, here they are again, right? So it's interesting that we could travel to different realms through hallucinogenic experiences, and that they are somehow common for people who take this kind of substances, and that they have similar narratives. So they are not just random experiences, but quite similar experiences, and some of them are very much alike, like the ones that are more on the line of anomalous experiences in UFO. And I think we cannot speak about UFO experiences or anomalous experiences without looking at least on some level into the stories of abductions. And the most famous book about abductions is by Professor John Mack, who actually got himself into lots of trouble because he considered this kind of accounts of abductions by his patients as real as possibly real. So first of all, he put under hypnosis over 60 people who claim to have UFO experiences, usually in the form of abductions. And he first checked them medically because he was a psychiatrist from Harvard. So he made sure that there is no history of mental sickness, and that they definitely believed that what they experienced was true. So through hypnosis, because hypnosis allows people to remember certain details that they remember only parts of their experiences without hypnosis, he reconstructed their experiences, what they believed were abductions. So I would like to discuss perhaps a couple of these experiences. So one is by a person who called himself Ed, and his experience happened when he was in his teens. He was camping in a car actually with his friend. They were both teenagers. And as they were falling asleep, so again, it is this kind of liminal space between sleep and waking, he noticed some figures around the car, and eventually he said he was floated out of the car into something that he could call like an amphitheater in a spaceship. And there he was examined, and also he was had an erotic encounter with this woman. He describes her as a small woman with triangular face, long blonde hair, and big dark eyes. And he said that he had a clear sense that that she was using this erotic encounter to pass some information to him. And later, this information or message from her became more apparent to him, but at that stage he wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew that he was being somehow used erotically for so this experience could be passed this way to him. And anyway, it could be really easily dismissed as a teenage fantasy, but there are some elements to this which I explain in Alien Goddess that make us think a little twice about it. Especially that in my other book, The Other Goddess, I discuss sexuality and spirituality, and the fact that in many esoteric traditions there are entities as feminine entities, then they're understood as entities rather than UFOs or aliens that use, such as Shaktis and the Dakinis, that use sexual energy to pass information to humans. So this is one account. Another account is by a woman called Eva, who believes that she had this kind of experiences since she was very little, and at the beginning she was not afraid of them. And usually it is quite a common story that children experience visitations from like small beings, and they're not afraid of them because the beings are playing with them, and the fear starts to increase as the experiences get older, especially in preteens and teens, because then the beings start to have some kind of sexual interest in them, not in a really sexual way, but rather they are interested in their sexual organs and they're examining them medically. So this is a kind of unpleasant part of this. And the most unpleasant part of this is, of course, that they were being floated out of their room according to their memories into a spaceship, into some kind of amphitheater without their will. So experience of Eva was such that she realized that once she stopped resisting it, the fear also subsided. And then once she stopped being afraid of us, she realized that they were actually trying to help themselves and also help us in some way. So they needed something from us, which I believe probably was some biological matter. That's why this kind of medical examination that very often happens during this kind of encounters, but also they were giving some warnings to humanity about I need to change our ways and our destructive ways. And she said that the main lesson for her from the abduction experiences were, apart from the fact that if you stop resisting and you stop being fearful, you actually understand why it is happening. And then you see a purpose for it, which is also, in her opinion, beneficial for humanity. It is that we focus too much on technology or the technological achievements of the beings, or we can call them aliens, rather than on the message that they want to transfer for us. And that was a very interesting part for me in this testimony. So what are these events? Are they UFOs, either spiritual events, either abductions, especially abductions, that they have some unpleasant element to this? For some people, a strong sexual element. For Ed, it wasn't unpleasant, right? Because he had, from his point of view, great erotic encounter. He just knew that this kind of sexual energy was used to transmit some message for him. And in the case of Eva, it was intimidating, and she felt a little bit. She felt violated until she decided that it somehow made sense to her. So, what are they? So there are many explanations, but my favorite explanation, or attempted explanations, but my favorite explanation comes from Professor Jeff Kripal, who talks about these liminal experiences which happen on the other side or on the threshold between waking and sleeping state, the space of imaginal. The space of imaginal, according to Professor Kripal, comes from a 19th century person, Frederick Myers, who believed that this imaginal space, it is the space between the larva and butterfly, right? So when we truly become who we are going to be, but we are not there yet, and we are in the great unknown. So this is this kind of also liminal space, which he calls imaginal, because it is also transformational space in our lives. So perhaps this kind of liminal experiences are in the space when we are actually being transformed into something else. We are receiving some message, and also for humanity, but also this kind of experiences, some of them quite unpleasant for some people, have also a transformational effect on many of these people afterwards. So this is possible explanation of the imaginal. Later in the book, I also give my own definition of imaginal, which gives us a little bit more control over what is happening. And I believe that we can actually, from my own experience, communicate both ways, that it doesn't have to be just downloads, but we actually can create a communication with the beings. And that's, for me, the difference between liminal and imaginal, when we actually can communicate. There's also one psychologist who wrote a paper called Your Brain is Not a Computer, It's a Transducer, when he makes experiments in which he wants those downloads that we get from some other realms, and lots of people do get them, happen in a more controlled way from the human point of view. Another interesting point that Professor Jeff Kripal made about this kind of events, it is that when he asked Whitley Strieber, the author of Communion and many other books, of course, on aliens and UFOs and anomalous experiences, that when Stryber asked the aliens or whoever the beings were, who they were, they said that they are basically a different aspect of us. So it's very interesting that they're actually a different aspect of us, or us perhaps from another dimension, which is a very interesting topic again, which needs to be explored. Other interpretations that came were related to perhaps us visiting us from the future. However, I think that it is quite interesting that some of these experiences are more of the liminal spaces and the other ones more of a technological space. And I'm not sure whether it is a focus at the moment, the focus of humanity, that we are more interested in technology than in the liminal or in spiritual, and that's why UFO events are usually interpreted in technological terms, or whether perhaps there are two sources of download, so to speak. Perhaps one source of download is of technological nature, and it comes perhaps from one group of the beings or aliens, and another one from more of a what we would call spiritual or liminal nature or space, which has a message warning us about what is going on at the moment, and usually in times of crisis for humanity. So I would really like to know your opinion about it, and I would appreciate your comments. As I say, this is the first time I speak publicly about it. I put lots of intense research into this book. So if you're interested, again, you can check Alien Goddess. I leave a link at the bottom. And I'm looking forward to communicating with you also, and reading your comments, and perhaps to a next video, which this time will be about the connection between UFOs, AI, and the goddesses of ascension. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the video. If you did, please like it and perhaps subscribe to my channel, and connect with me via my book, Alien Goddess. Thank you.